The Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, is doing its thing, but Congress can cut waste and cruelty now, and it's a bipartisan effort that can save dollars and animals' lives at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. The time has come for the Cargo Act. Next on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. After a PETA investigation on a Colombian lab showed a disregard for animals' lives and cruelty, PETA got Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress on board to stop the millions of dollars being sent overseas for research. Here's my conversation with PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo on the PETA Podcast. So the Cargo Act, and there are 5 things you need to know about: NIH funding, cruelty overseas, and the Cargo Act. And here's Kathy Guillermo. Kathy, welcome to the PETA Podcast.
Very happy to be here.
And tell me, all right, so the National Institutes of Health, NIH, is funding cruel animal experiments overseas. What's wrong with that?
Well, let's take a look at how much money we're talking about first. Between the fiscal years of 2011 and 2021, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH for short, gave approximately $2.2 billion to 200 foreign organizations, funding 1,357 grants and contracts involving experiments on animals. Now, these funds went to 45 countries in Europe, South America, Asia, and Canada. The problem with this is that all of these animal experimenters lack accountability. There's inadequate oversight, and as a result, there is often animal abuse, fraud, and research misconduct. And there's no effective mechanism in place right now for NIH to make sure that there is even compliance with basic animal welfare standards in these foreign labs. So this becomes important when we talk about the kinds of things they're doing to animals. Just a few examples of experiments funded in foreign laboratories. Dogs addicted to opioids and rats addicted to cocaine. They're force-feeding highly toxic substances to beagles. They're causing strokes in monkeys. They're blinding monkeys. They're infecting pigs with parasites, removing the eyes of mice, infecting bats with really harmful viruses that are transmissible to humans, forcing mice to eat amphetamines and alcohol, infecting mice with gonorrhea. That's just a sampling of the kinds of things that our tax money is paying for in overseas labs.
Are there any positive things that come out of these experiments? Is there a reason why these experiments exist?
The experiments exist so that experimenters can make money. That's really what it comes down to, because most of these experiments, as we know, don't lead to treatments for humans any more than when they're conducted in the U.S. But when they're conducted outside of this country, there's no mechanism for making sure that there's not abuse and fraud. And, I have some examples of that. Some of the things that we have uncovered is in a university in China funded by the NIH. There were experiments in which mice were injected with cancer cells. They grew these enormous tumors. And when the experiment was done, the experimenters falsified the graphs to downplay the magnitude of the animal's pain. So that's falsifying information. At another university in China, mice were again subjected to really painful cancer treatments, and the experimenters faked their graphs and lied about their data. So all of that's very difficult to uncover. In these cases, it was uncovered, but for years, some of these places have gone on without anybody detecting the kinds of abuse that's happened.
So these research grants, they're kind of like outsourcing to foreign companies research that could be done in America. Is this any different from what NIH is doing in the U.S., or is it important to go elsewhere?
It's not really outsourcing, because many of these experiments are going on in the U.S., but I think you've hit on the second of 5 very important things to know, that these experiments are different from what NIH is doing in the United States, because in this country, as cruel as the experimentation is and as poor as the oversight is, there is at least some oversight. We have agencies, federal agencies, that inspect many laboratories. When we're talking about experiments conducted in Switzerland or Peru or Italy, we have to understand that NIH doesn't do any inspections of these foreign animal laboratories. They don't require any regulatory authority in those countries to inspect the laboratories. These labs don't have to report violations of guidelines and regulations. They don't require foreign laboratories to have institutional animal care and use committees, and these are oversight committees that review proposed experiments just to make sure there is compliance with laws and regulations. Now, every one of these things is required in the United States. So we're shipping money overseas to harm animals in foreign countries without even having the same standards that we have here in the U.S.
And it leads to this being more boondoggle than science.
In many cases, that is true. And that brings you to the third most important point for people to know. And that is that we exposed this kind of fraud in South America, in Colombia, South America. And this was done through very careful investigative work by Dr. Magnolia Martinez on my team, who is from Colombia originally. And she found that between 2003 and 2023, so that's 20 years, NIH gave more than $17 million to a Colombian organization, a couple of research institutes under the same umbrella, the Caucaseco Scientific Research Center and the Malaria Vaccine and Development Center. And these were for projects that involved malaria experiments on mice and on owl monkeys. Now, owl monkeys are a vulnerable species in that country. What we found is basically that this research institute that was raking in millions of dollars from NIH, their laboratory was essentially a stack of cages in the forest covered with a plastic tarp. There was no veterinarian on site. The monkeys were living in absolute filth. The mice didn't have enough to eat and had resorted to cannibalism. And when we exposed this, the Colombian government came in, they launched investigations, they rescued 180 mice and 108 monkeys who are now in sanctuaries. They fined the experimenters $281,000 for lacking permits to capture and experiment on these monkeys. And there is now a criminal investigation underway. So this was $17 million, and nobody in NIH bothered to see what was going on at this facility.
Why didn't it strike a nerve somewhere?
Because NIH isn't set up to do that, and in my opinion, simply doesn't care. It doesn't matter whether a research organization is making $1 million a year or $6 million a year from our U.S. taxes. The lack of accountability remains the same. They just have different standards for overseas laboratories. And that's in addition to the ethics of this situation and the unreliability of the science. Holding these labs to a different standard simply isn't something that we should tolerate as taxpayers.
Now, legislators are taking action. There was the Cargo Act, the Cease Animal Research Grants Overseas Act. What happened to it last year?
Well, that's the fourth most important point to know on this topic, and that is that legislators have reintroduced the Cargo Act. And it just last week was reintroduced by Representative Troy Nehls, a Republican from Texas, and Representative Dina Titus, a Democrat from Nevada. It is a bipartisan act. It started off with 9 sponsors, 9 from both parties. And what this would do is halt NIH's funding of foreign laboratories that conduct experiments on animals. So it does not say NIH can fund nothing overseas. It simply says if you're going to use an animal, NIH isn't paying for it because we have no mechanism in place to make sure you're doing it right. And that would take care of this problem immediately.
And so this legislation is reintroduced, the Cargo Act, prospects of being passed.
You know, I'm very hopeful this year. And I think we have an administration and a Congress that has the will to make change at NIH. And we've seen some shakeup there already. I don't know how all of that will turn out, but honestly, that NIH needs to be picked up, shaken out, turned inside out, and redone. And so I do know that members of Congress agree with us that there isn't enough accountability, that the fraud that has occurred overseas and the abuse and the suffering of the animals mean that NIH just shouldn't have the freedom to toss our money away like that.
Right now, we're in the midst of a Doge ascendance into Washington in all these different aspects of government spending. Is this in line with Doge thinking? And has Doge caught? Has any of this caught the eye of Doge?
I'm quite certain that it has. And I have to say to that, however, that this is really an issue that both Democrats and Republicans care about. NIH waste has been on the radar of Congress for a long time. But we do have now Doge, and they are right now looking at what the issues are at NIH. And so we know that they have seen that overseas funding has led to a lot of problems. So yes, I'm pretty sure they're having a look at this.
How about people, ordinary people out there listening? What kind of action can they take on this issue of stopping the annual research grants going overseas?
Well, the wonderful thing about legislation is that we all have a voice. Every single person in America has a representative in Congress. And the important thing to do is to get in touch with that representative. We have made it easy. If you go to PETA.org, there is an action alert. And all you have to do is basically click a few things to send an email to your representative. But it's also important to make phone calls. They need to hear from constituents that they care. And all you have to do is call up your representative in Congress and say, I am Jane Doe, and I am your constituent, and I urge you to co-sponsor and support the Cargo Act. It's really simple, and it carries a lot of weight.
And if this gets passed, what does it mean for the animals? What does it mean for either the end of cruelty and experimentation and for the animals, the well-being of animals in general?
It will spare thousands of animals. There's no question. When I look at the photos of what we uncovered in Colombia, it's sickening. You see these tiny little owl monkeys with their big eyes, and they're crouched in these filthy cages on plastic tubing, clinging to each other. And this in no way resembles a laboratory or good science. And so to be able to have shut that place down was very important for us and for these animals. But to be able to prevent it from ever happening again is extremely important.
That's Kathy Guillermo on the Cargo Act, Cease Animal Research Grants Overseas, Cargo Act. Reintroduce this session in Congress, and you can voice your opinion by going to PETA.org. Incidentally, I point you to the podcast episode 316 about a new play with an anti-speciesist theme. It was in 2024. It was just an online production, but if you're in New York City right now, you can catch the Shine Challenge 2025. It's live Thursday the 13th through Sunday the 16th at the Theater for the New City, 155 First Avenue at 10th Street. It's in the Lower East Side, First Avenue and 10th. Go to theaterforthenewcity.net for tickets. It's a play where the animals have their say, and it's also perfect for Black History Month. And I'm in the production as the villain, so of course you'll want to see that, wouldn't you? Theaterforthenewcity.net for tickets to the Shine Challenge 2025. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Season 8. We're in Season 8. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on X, that's Twitter, at emilamok, EMILAMOK. You can also find me on Substack.com at emilamok. See this podcast on YouTube at emilamok1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to, as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is normally provided by CarbonWorks, but since we're traveling, we left the orchestra at home. Hey, check them out on YouTube, though, CarbonWorks. They provide the music for all of our podcast needs. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.